This is Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, back again with Mr. Monitor himself, Jay Rosen, for this episode of This Week in FCPA, episode 244 for the week ending March 19, 2021, the mask-free Texas edition. As March Madness is in the bubble this year, Jay, there's still a lot of good compliance and ethics stories from the past week. What say you?
I say I'm still wearing my green from St. Patty's Day, so Aaron, go brah.
Is that J.O. Rosen?
Aye, it is.
It is. Well, welcome everyone. And as always, if you have any questions, put them into the chat function. And we begin with our first story, which is about the ECI report, which came out at the end of last week. And this is the Global Business Ethics Survey. It's done every, I think, 4 years, 3 years. And it takes a look at corporate compliance practitioners and their perceptions. And it had some pretty troubling findings, Jay. And I'd like to just highlight one, which was retaliation rates have skyrocketed. In the U.S., retaliation for those who reported or whistleblowers was up 79% in 2020. It's an increase of 35 percentage points. As the GBES dryly noted, if left unaddressed, high rates of retaliation can erode ethical culture and undermine efforts to encourage employees to speak up and raise concerns. Pat Harned, the president of ECI, has done a 5-part podcast series with me that's running this week on the FCPA Compliance Report, releasing every day at 10 a.m. I've also blogged about this report. Matt Kelly over on Radical Compliance has a couple of blogs up on this report. ECI had a podcast today, which I'm sure will be available for replay. They also, Pat was a part of a panel that I was on a Conversant podcast on whistleblower retaliation on Tuesday, which is available at the Converge community. This is something, Jay, that I hope every compliance practitioner will take a look at the report itself, and the report's free. Take a look at this report. The findings are very troubling. There's an increase in pressure to cut corners. There's an increase in perceived misconduct. There's an increase in reported misconduct. And then this finding, which is perhaps the most troubling, of retaliation. And Jay, this does not include employees who were terminated. This is only current employees. So for all those employees who were terminated, who raised their hand and spoke up or reported on the helpline, that's equally troubling. There's some conclusions and recommendations, and also a fairly good, robust discussion of the impact of COVID-19 on culture. So I'd urge everyone to check out the 5 podcast series, check out any of the blogs I've referenced, and certainly download a copy of the report. It's easily digestible, but it's something every compliance practitioner needs to be cognizant of. Jay?
Great. Next up, Tom, we're going to check in with Harry Casson from the FCPA blog. And he tells us that Novartis has announced their new anti-bribery and corruption compliance program. Novartis updated its anti-bribery policy 4 months after the Swiss pharma paid $346.7 million to resolve FCPA offenses in Greece, Vietnam, South Korea. Here are some interesting details from the latest version. Number 1, as you may expect, no gifts, even culturally appropriate unbranded ones. Gifts of any kind, including personal gifts, cultural acknowledgments, or promotional aids, etc., whether branded or unbranded, must be provided to healthcare professionals or their families. Rather, must not. Number 2, use the front page test to avoid embarrassment. Before giving a gift or providing a hospitality, consider whether the reputation of Novartis, yourself, or the recipient is likely to be damaged if news of the gift, hospitality, or entertainment appeared on the front page of a newspaper. If this would embarrass either the company or the recipient, please do not proceed. Number 3, no facilitating payments, even if legal. Novartis prohibits facilitation payments, irrespective of whether local law permits facilitation payments. This policy is similar to Apple. In contrast, Tesla might approve of some facilitating payments. Number 4, public versus private, not so different in Novartis's eyes. The company does not distinguish between public officials and employees of private sector organizations so far as bribery is concerned. However, it's important to recognize that public officials are often subject to rules and restrictions that do not apply to individual people who operate in the private sector. And number 5, in some places, even healthcare professionals are considered public officials. In some countries, doctors, pharmacists, clinical trials investigators, and even nurses are public officials, irrespective of whether they are working at a government institution or not. We have linked to the full policy in the show notes, so please check it out at your leisure. Back to you, Tom.
Jay, next up, we have an article from our friend Neil Hodge over at Compliance Week, and it reports on a presentation by Lisa Osofsky, director of the UK Serious Fraud Office, and Dan Kahn, acting chief of the fraud section at the U.S. Department of Justice. And they talked about the closer working ties and information sharing between the agencies. Although not reported in the piece, I'm sure this regards the kerfuffle that developed between the DOJ and SFO around the Unaoil case, where the DOJ demanded that the SFO fire the top investigator on the Unaoil matter, which Lisa Osofsky caved in and did. That person, Tom Martin, then sued for wrongful termination, and he was successful. So a huge black eye from the SFO. Also, questionable conduct by Lisa Osofsky, allowing the Ashanti brothers, the CEO and CFO or COO of Unaoil, to visit directly with defendants in the United Kingdom without their lawyers present. Apparently, that's a huge no-no in the UK. So some serious things that the SFO needed to clear up. And of course, they recently lost a huge case at the UK Supreme Court around document production involving the U.S. energy services company, KBR. So probably not surprising we saw this, although certainly close cooperation between the SFO and DOJ has been a mainstay of worldwide anti-bribery, anti-corruption compliance, or rather enforcement. So it's good to see that they're back together. I certainly hope that we don't have any more of these kerfuffles. Interestingly, Osofsky denied that the SFO's perceived heavy-handedness in the KBR matter. I would note that today the SFO publicly announced they were dropping their KBR investigation with no findings or charges against KBR. So that really spoke, I think, volumes as to where the SFO was. They said that COVID-19 disruption is an opportunity for compliance functions to protect budgets and perhaps even to increase them. The SFO will have a new focus, looking at companies that have committed high-level fraud on the back end of the pandemic. And then the DOJ is absolutely exploring using AI and other technologies to help with its investigation. So check out Neil's article in Compliance Week going forward.
Great. Thanks, Tom. Now it's time for our weekly check-in with the NYU Compliance and Enforcement blog. We've got 4 attorneys from Wilmer Hale, who are Perry Lange, Brian Mahana, Nicole Callan, and Alvaro Mateo Alonso, and they're going to take a look at the state of antitrust law in New York State. Although much attention recently has been focused on debates in Congress, potential legislative changes to U.S. antitrust law are not limited to proposals at the federal level. Many states are considering changes to their own antitrust laws, which can usually be enforced by state AGs and private plaintiffs. Importantly, New York state legislators have introduced 2 bills that propose sweeping changes to the state's antitrust law. The Donnelly Act, building on measures introduced in New York's last legislative session. Here's a quick overview of the New York antitrust legislation. In January of 2021, New York State Senator and Deputy Majority Leader Michael Gianaris introduced the 21st Century Antitrust Act, seeking changes in New York's antitrust law. Here is how the revised legislation would affect people. First of all, it would prohibit unilateral conduct that creates or maintains a monopoly. It would create an unprecedented in the United States abuse of dominance offense based on European law and give the New York Attorney General rulemaking authority to carry out this provision. It would require merger notifications to the NYAG of at least 60 days prior to the consummation of any transaction holding more than $8 million in assets. It would authorize significantly higher fines for violations of the Donnelly Act, and it would authorize actions by the New York Attorney General on behalf of injured individuals and businesses for violations of the Donnelly Act. New York Attorney General Letitia James testified in support of the prior version of the bill in a hearing before the Senate Consumer Protection Committee. Here's an analysis of significant proposed changes. First of all, the European-inspired abuse of dominance offense. The Donnelly Act does not contain an analog to Section 2 of the Sherman Act, which prohibits single firm conduct that creates and maintains monopoly power. Senator Gianaris's proposal would amend the statute with language that is similar to Section 2. However, the proposal would go substantially further than federal or any other U.S. state law in addressing single firm conduct. There's a mandatory pre-merger notification. This would require companies to notify the New York Attorney General of any transaction that will result in their acquirer holding more than $8 million of assets or voting securities of the target in the aggregate if the acquirer or the target are subject to jurisdiction of New York courts. What's next for other states? The original 21st Century Antitrust Act was introduced too late in last year's session to pass, though the state Senate did hold a hearing. Given the intense public focus on antitrust, there is reason to believe that the legislature will seriously consider these bills. An open question is whether other states will pursue antitrust law. While not a sweeping of the New York bills, other states have and continue to consider their own measures. Last year, Colorado amended its antitrust law to allow the AG to challenge mergers that have been reviewed but not challenged by federal authorities. And a bill is in the Puerto Rico legislature, which would enable the Attorney General to bring actions to recover treble damages and attorney's fees as parens patriae on behalf of indirect buyers of the products that were subject to cartel activity. Given the growing spotlight on antitrust, other state legislators may consider their own bills in the coming months. Back to you, Tom.
So, Jay, some untoward news from Mingy Sun at the Risk and Compliance Journal over at the Wall Street Journal, and that is that NatWest, that's National Westheimer Bank in the United Kingdom, is facing criminal charges for allegedly failing to prevent money laundering. The proceeding is the first criminal prosecution brought by the UK financial regulator based on a 2007 money laundering rule, and it's the first prosecution against a bank under that regulation. The Financial Conduct Authority, the UK regulator, alleges that NatWest failed to adequately and effectively have money laundering controls in place, particularly how it relates or handles funds deposited into accounts of a corporate customer. The prosecutors have said that increasingly large deposits were made into accounts of a corporate client, a money service business around £365 million, about $500,000 was paid into the customer's account. Over 60% was cash. So interesting prosecution. This could be very damaging for NatWest. UK money laundering laws require some companies to conduct and demonstrate risk-based due diligence and ongoing monitoring of their customers. And this is a huge hole in UK money laundering laws and indeed UK money laundering protections, not only for the individual banks, but literally for the country as a whole. Who knows where this money went, whether it funded terrorism, whether it went to nefarious actors in Russia, China, or other enemies of the United Kingdom. So big trouble for NatWest.
So we're going to check in now with the coolest guy in compliance, Matt Kelly. He's usually writing to us out of Radical Compliance, but this week he appears on Navex Global's Risk and Compliance Matter blog. And Matt wants to take a look at leveraging due diligence to strengthen supply chain risk management. Better management of supply chain risk is a top priority for corporations these days, and that should be no surprise to compliance officers. Supply chains are longer and more complex, with more third parties participating in them than ever before. The suppliers themselves also pose more risk: legal, logistical, reputational, regulatory, and cybersecurity, just to name a few. And that was all before COVID-19 arrived. The pandemic underlined how unprepared for supply chain disruption many companies were and brought the perils of supply chain risk into the painfully sharp relief. The challenge is now, how do you leverage your due diligence program into a better supply chain management wisely? First, Matt says, consider the fundamentals. The goal with supply chain risk management and anti-corruption due diligence is fundamentally the same. You want to build an accurate risk profile of the third party so the risk profile can inform you on how your business will work with that third party, including the option of not working with the party at all. So how do you build this risk profile? By collecting data during the onboarding process? Supply chain risk management just involves many more types of data. One early step in developing a supply chain risk management program will be to define the types of data you want and then develop procedures to collect that information. This is where the blending of compliance and risk management starts to appear. For example, when we say define the type of data you want, that should lead you to say perform a risk assessment, because performing a risk assessment is the first step in understanding the data you'll need to collect. But a risk assessment for regulatory compliance and risk assessment for supply chain operations aren't exactly the same thing. You'll need to use multiple risk management frameworks to work through the risks that your business might confront to understand the information you need to collect. Second, understand the importance of technology when we talk about developing procedures to collect the information. Next, build a sustainable solution. Artificial intelligence will play an increasingly important role in supply chain risk management. That's because you'll be pulling together so many different types of data that they will all need to be woven into one supplier's risk profile. Second, astute monitoring of your suppliers will be just as important as onboarding them. Supply chain risk can change for numerous factors. Your operations change, the supplier's operations change, or their external risk environment may change. Small swings in circumstance could cause profound changes in your organization's risk. Again, this isn't a task you undertake manually. You'll need automation to support your efforts. Third, remember the remediation work that comes first. You're likely to have a lot of it. That will require sophisticated systems to track which remediation work has already been done, which is running late, and what comes next. Capabilities such as automated alerting and escalation will be your best friends. Finally, play your cards right. Leveraging due diligence into supply chain risk management is a complex endeavor, but remember, it's also an excellent opportunity for the compliance function to play a larger, more valuable role across the enterprise. With planning and effective use of technology, compliance officers can demonstrate yet again that a good compliance program can be a strategic advantage for your business. Tom?
So Jay, we have another article from the Wall Street Journal Risk and Compliance Journal. This one's from Dylan Tascam. And I know that you can channel your inner Captain Reno quite well in this, because I'm sure you were shocked, simply shocked. Was that your shocked face?
I'm shocked
that Brascom is now internally investigating bribery allegations made by the bribe receiver, former president of Pemex, who says that Brascom bribed him. I know you're shocked, perhaps even double shocked, because it's Pemex and Brascom. Wow, I've never seen your double shocked face. What makes this so inane, or perhaps troubling is an even better word, is that in 2016, Brascom had a major settlement with the Department of Justice. It was part of the Odebrecht settlement. Brascom was a subsidiary of Odebrecht, and both Odebrecht and Brascom paid a combined $3.5 billion, that's with a B, to settle their bribery cases. How this matter could not have been uncovered at that time is frankly beyond my inner Captain Reno. Nevertheless, the former CEO of Pemex has made these allegations. I believe he's under investigation in Mexico. And now Brascom is taking a look at this through an internal investigation. It was not reported who the law firm is. So if Brascom violated this agreement, obviously that will not be good for Brascom also, they've completed their monitorship. So you have to wonder how effective all of that was if it takes the bribe receiver saying, hey, you guys paid me a bribe to get an internal investigation going. But just another black eye for Brascom. Frankly, I don't know how the company can stay in business with an obvious culture of corruption that has not changed if this is just coming out. But once again, great story by Dylan Tokar on top of things. And it's if you're doing business in Mexico, you certainly need to be cognizant of this. And with the change or proposed change in Mexican law to take away U.S. investment in PMEX, it means it will be no U.S. companies involved as an investor in PMEX. So it could give rise to additional allegations of corruption.
So, Tom, I think this is my favorite article, and it might have to do that we like Game of Thrones in this household and Harry Potter's and all things dragon. But this comes to us from Aaliyah Noor from the Experts League blog, and it's Internal Auditors Navigation COVID, Here Be Dragons. Here be dragons was a phrase frequently used in the 1700s and earlier by cartographers, map makers, to make a mark on maps identifying uncharted waters. It was meant to warn mariners from dangerous areas where sea monsters and dragons were believed to exist and to take caution. Companies are dealing with adverse consequences of COVID-19, such as liquidity crunch, resource constraints, underutilized assets, legal and contractual non-compliances, and in certain cases, ongoing concerns, which demand rapid responses in an environment that changes by the hour. In these times, internal audit have both an obligation and an opportunity to help their companies manage the most critical risks that COVID-19 has either created or magnified. By assisting management in weighing risk and opportunities to make informed decisions based on and backed up by evidence to convince top management to act. While exploring Here Be Dragons, areas to know where dragons lurk and hide, internal audit must play both advisor and insurer's role in dealing with them. Some of the roles are mentioned below and may vary according to industry. Explore and understand COVID-19's impact on your industry and business. Navigate and connect with key departments to assess existing and emerging risks. Evaluate emerging risks of newer operating models and business practices and redirect your attention to the most time-sensitive risks. Monitor increased cybersecurity threats due to increased VPN or mobile device usage as more employees work remotely. Look for new third-party risks due to operations and supply chain disruption. Finance and liquidity challenges may arise from revenue shortfalls, debt servicing requirements, covenant breaches, and rising consumer credit risk. Challenge management's forecasts that directly impact financial reporting, e.g. going concerns, pension scheme accounting, goodwill intangibles, and inspected credit lots. And then challenge management, assessment, monitoring, and contingency plans of key outside service providers. Internal audit must look through the risk lens beyond annual routine and step up to help and guide organizations through the pandemic. By predicting the unpredictable and by dealing with risks and uncertainties, you too may avoid trouble on the high sea. Tom, back to you.
So Jay, our good friend Jonathan Marks, our Everything Compliance cohort, has an interesting article that I think every compliance practitioner needs to take a look at on his blog, Board and Fraud. And he talks about continuous improvement through continuous monitoring. And we talk about data analytics, but I don't think we talk enough about continuous monitoring as a driver for continuous improvement. And continuous auditing has become a necessary tool in compliance and audit profession to provide reasonable assurances that the control structure around operational environment is suitably designed. Jonathan is actually going to put on a workshop on this, and so I hope that you can sign up for it. It is available, information rather, and registration is available on his site, Board and Fraud. It doesn't have a date yet, but it'll be a data analytics and continuous auditing, continuous monitoring workshop. So check that out. Jonathan is really one of the leading experts around continuous monitoring and control, continuous control monitoring, continuous auditing for continuous monitoring and continuous improvement under the FCPA. And as everyone will recall, this was mandated in the 2020 evaluation to the update of corporate compliance programs released by the Department of Justice last June. So check it out. Sign up for the event. I'm sure it will be excellent, as everything else Jonathan does, including the most recent Baker Tilly fraud summit that he held back in February. So Jay?
So for my last article of the day, we're going to talk to a couple of voices from compliance and take a look at what board of directors and senior execs see as the top risk for 2021. A recent survey conducted by Protiviti and North Carolina State's ERM initiative disclosed the influence of COVID-19 pandemic, the economy, digital technology, talent, and organizational resiliency. And these are on the landscape over the near term. Protiviti's Jim Deloach outlines the most significant risks. We also take a look at the C-Suite Challenge 2021, leading in a post-COVID-19 recovery. Since 2017, the C-Suite Challenge has expanded the survey pool beyond CEOs to include the entire C-Suite. This year's survey, conducted following the U.S. elections in November of 2020, asked CEOs and C-Suite executives for their views on external stress points that they face and the strategies they will focus on to mitigate risk and seize opportunity as part of a post-COVID-19 recovery. Insights for what's ahead. When asked which issues outside of management control will have the greatest impact on their business, CEOs cite the COVID-19 virus, vaccine availability, and changing consumer buyer behaviors. However, despite modest growth expectations for the global economy in both the short and long term, business leaders seem unable to shake lingering concerns of recession. 2021, the light at the end of the pandemic tunnel. CEOs believe the distribution of successful COVID-19 vaccines will have a significant impact on their business in the coming year. Lessons learned: adaptability, flexibility, clear communication, and the need for quick, decisive action while maintaining calmness under fire. They have learned they have a need for speed. CEOs say their organizations will focus on accelerating digital transformation, modifying business models, and improving innovation. The business model challenge. Organizations must quickly pivot in response to new risks and opportunities, requiring an extraordinary level of alignment. Leaders of growth. While consumer buying behaviors are changing, they see new products and services and new customer segments driven by data analytics and expanded strategic partnerships as key levers of growth. Human capital management. Despite the economic doldrums, CEOs remain focused on the recruitment and retention of top talent. Remote working has reached equilibrium. A year into the pandemic, remote work may have reached an equilibrium, and few responding CEOs planning to make significant changes to the current number of remote workers. Policy impacts. The change in the U.S. administration appears to have an impact on CEOs' view of the global business environment. This year's survey shows that businesses have diminished levels of concern about trade disruption, global political instability, and declining trust in the government. Taking a look beyond the pandemic, the long-term legacies of COVID-19. CEOs anticipate a reduction in business travel, the automation of tasks, large firms having better access to capital markets, and more resilient supply chains as an increased focus on the climate change among the most likely long-term legacies. In terms of social justice and climate risk, compared to issues such as the pandemic and recession risks, CEOs do not see social justice concerns and climate change as having an immediate impact on the business environment in 2021. Supply chain fixes. Even though concerns about global trade disruption have diminished, the pandemic has exposed vulnerabilities in our supply chains, and CEOs believe these need to be addressed. Leading in a post-COVID-19 recovery. When asked about which issues outside of management control will have the greatest impact on their business, CEOs cite the COVID-19 virus, vaccine availability, and changing consumer buyer patterns as game changers for 2021. CEOs believe the distribution of a successful vaccine will have a significant impact on their business in the coming year. While several factors are contributing to the recent rise in CEO confidence in the US and Europe, the survey indicates vaccine distribution is contributing to the more positive view of future growth by taking the worst-case economic scenarios out of play. The increased availability of COVID vaccines will also provide greater clarity and predictability around short-term planning and operations, such as when physical workplaces can reopen and the dependability of supply chains. Tom, we're now ready to go into the podcast. Part of our podcast. What do we have coming up on the Compliance Podcast Network this week?
And that was Rob Chestnut on The Compliance Life, moving to the Chief Compliance Officer role at Airbnb. That was certainly a fascinating discussion. Microsoft has two podcasts on the Compliance Podcast Network. In the Voices of Data Protection, they talked about the value of information governance. And I don't think that's something that most compliance practitioners think about or even cognizant of, but the governance of your information can be a very valuable asset. And then over on Uncovering Hidden Risk, how about looking at HR data to uncover hidden risks? It's not something that's often done. And once again, Uncovering Hidden Risk does not focus on third parties. It focuses on internal risk. So it's typically not within the something that the compliance officer thinks about, but Talamir and Raymond Collin have convinced me that you as a compliance officer need to be aware of internal risks. As for a 5-part series that I mentioned, I have Pat Harned the entire week on the ECI 2021 Global Business Ethics Survey. In episode 1, we looked at key trends. In episode 2, we looked at some of the key findings. We focused solely on the retaliation finding that I talked about before in episode 3. In episode 4, we took a look at something that probably you and your AMI colleagues are thinking about, Jay, which is the impact of COVID-19 on culture. And then today in part 5, we looked at conclusions and recommendations. So check out that 5-part series. We link to the ECI report in each episode. I would urge every listener to download it and read it. It's chock full of information. But here's what the event I want to talk about, Jay: Ethics Madness. A little bit of history. Jason Meyer came up with this idea, a noted ethics expert in our field. Many people will remember him from Compliance Week or SCCE conferences, well-known ethics and compliance practitioner, but a little more focus on ethics, I think. And about 5 years ago, Jason approached me and a few others, Amy McDougall and a couple of others, about having a ethics event while March Madness was going on, in the first day of March Madness. This year in the bubble, the first day of March Madness is on Friday. Typically it's on Thursday. And it's truly one of the great sporting events of the year. It is, I think it's 36 basketball games literally across the country, and just some fabulous hoops, great upsets, great traditions, all the way from the 16 seeds, once upsetting a number 1 seed. So you can have some big upsets and some great play. But we're going to watch the game, and then we're going to have an ongoing ethics chat. And Jason is our ringmaster, posing questions and guiding our discussions. This year we're going to be on Zoom, so we'll be fully interactive. So I hope that everyone will settle themselves in front of a big screen or other TV. Hopefully you're not at a bar this year, unless you're in the great state of Texas where bars are open again. But you got your computer and you can join us for Ethics Madness. I know I always have a ton of fun. I hope you'll be able to join us this year, Jay, and I'm really looking forward to it.
So it'll almost be like the sports book in Vegas, but not the sports book in Vegas.
Almost.
So Tom, why don't you tell our listeners and viewers what you can do for them if they would like to purchase the Compliance Handbook 2nd edition, which is now available for pre-sale purchase?
Well, listeners to this podcast can get a 25% discount. We've got the code in the show notes. So check out the handbook. And I also should probably plug the podcast series. I'm doing a pod tubing event in honor of this new book release. That's a video podcast. And this week I have Karen Woody. Karen's a professor at WNL, and she focuses on internal controls in the Securities and Exchange Commission. She's one of the top legal academicians around SEC and SEC practice. Clear, concise, kind of, no BS, writing about the SEC. And I had the chance to sit down with her to talk about internal controls. It was a great interview. So you can check out Karen. Last week, I think we had Mary Shirley, the Gwick girls, Mary Shirley and Lisa Fine, talking about policies and procedures. We've had Mike Volkov talking about boards of directors, Stephen Martin talking about compliance programs. So it's been a great series. Coming up, we have Amy Bernard Bond, who's going to talk to us about the role of HR and compliance. So check out the Compliance Handbook. If you want to go to YouTube for the video presentation, it's available on my YouTube channel. And then it's also available on the Compliance Podcast Network, JD Supra, and it has its own iTunes channel. So check all that out and then go buy the book with the discount, Jay.
So if you'd like to reach Tom, who is the voice of compliance, he can be reached at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. And I'm Jay Rosen, Mr. Monitor. You can reach me at the initial JROSEN at affiliatedmonitors.com. So on behalf of Tom Fox and myself, we'd like to thank you for joining us for This Week in FCPA, episode 244 for the week ending March 19th, 2021, the mask-free edition. We hope to hear from you tomorrow at the beginning of our ethics and basketball event. And we hope that you have a great weekend. Thank you for joining us, and we'll talk to you next week on This Week in FCPA.